Hi everyone, this is Dr. Raquel Butler from Integrated Veterinary Therapeutics.
And Sophie Vandenberg from Equine Postulate. And we welcome you to the Equine Functional Posture Podcast, your ultimate source for insights into the influence of functional posture on biomechanics, health, and overall well-being of horses.
Whether you're a seasoned equestrian, an equine professional, or simply a horse enthusiast, this podcast is designed to help you understand the critical aspects of functional posture.
Tune in each week as we discuss practical tips, delve into expert interviews, and explore the latest research in the impact of functional posture on equine anatomy, physiology, movement, and more.
Let's create a world where we empower our horses to be in a mental, emotional, and physical balance. Hi everyone, welcome to the episode today to help you develop your eye. So we're going to give you 3 things that you can observe in motion to enhance your eye. So how are you today, Sophie?
Hi, Raquel. I'm going really well. This episode came on the back of some others where we've been talking about what you see in your horses with certain postural issues, etc. So we're going to give 3 quantifiable things that you can just go out and observe with your horses today.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the head and the neck position, the pelvis position, and limb alignment. So they're the 3 areas that we're going to discuss. And we're mostly discussing watching them from behind and in front. So you can easily kind of set up a video on something and just walk towards it and away from it. And then look back at your video afterwards and just focus on these 3 areas. It's also really good to have observations of your horse because sometimes, we're only observing them in certain ways, like we might only be riding them. We might not take that much notice of them when they're moving in the paddock, but you can just use it when you're watching them in the paddock. And the more you kind of understand your horse's baseline, the more knowledge you have of that, the more you're going to pick up things and pick them up earlier so that you can recognize them and get help with them before they become an obvious issue, which often people pick them up in by the time they become behavioral, and it would be awesome if you could pick it up before your horses had a shift in their behavior.
Definitely.
So what's the first one we're going to talk about, Sophie?
Actually, just before we do that, I just wanted to say when you were saying that, you can set up a video. So that's if you're by yourself. If you have somebody to film, it's always a bonus. And sometimes you have somebody leading the horse and you film your horse, or it's the other way around. Just wanted to say there's a real skill to leading a horse straight, particularly because the instant that someone's filming you, you self-conscious sometimes I know when I make an observation before body work, sometimes they'll turn and look at their horse while I'm looking, like we're both looking together. It's fun, it's interesting. If you want to get a really good straight walk of your horse, it's sometimes useful. Some tools you can have are using a fence line or the side of a shed if your horse will walk straight along them. So if you can have somebody stand on the fence and you walk up and down it with the horse between you and the fence, or you're on the fence, it's great because it's often us, like as we move, they'll move with us, and then that changes your observation. So if you just walk straight and you try not to hold too hard onto their head, because that'll restrict how they'll move it, and that goes through their whole body as well. It's nice to just go up and down along a fence line. Do you have any other tips for people if they just wanted a standard straight line?
No, it's quite an art. And even if you are going into the trot, like I see a lot of people pull their horse into the trot. And when I'm leading a horse for a trot up, I'll actually kind of jump myself into the trot, but try not to pull them, or use a rope behind to tell them to get up, because then I see horses that are kind of moving to the side because they're getting told to get up with a rope. So usually I'll give them a couple of preps where I'll jump up into the trot, and then every horse, usually like most horses, will figure that out without me needing to use any pressure on the head, like minimal pressure on the head, and I don't need to use any flicking of the rope behind me, because that really changes the way that they trot. So yeah, I think they're all really valuable tools. And also if we pull on their head, you'll often get that little bit of like head up and resistance up, and so you're not seeing a good picture of just how they would trot normally.
Definitely.
Awesome.
So if you were just starting off and you're watching a horse from in front, so they're walking towards you, and you're going to be looking at their head and neck, what are the things that you would be looking for?
Yeah, so one of the things is just how does the head and neck sit relative to the sternum? So if you look at that midpoint between their front legs, so, some horses you might see that their head and neck looks like it's over to one side. Some horses will be influenced by the handler in this situation, and they'll have their head and neck a little towards the handler. So you might want to swap sides with the handler, or I've had one horse that was always turning its head towards the paddock. So we had to kind of trot it in a different direction. So just be aware of environmental influences. But yeah, if the whole neck is off to one side, or if the head is twisted or flexed a little to one side, that's probably looking at that alignment. And then looking at how the nose aligns with the neck. So you're looking at head and neck alignment with the sternum, but then you could have a neck that's aligned with the sternum, but the nose tilts in one direction or the other direction. So there are a couple. What else would you say from the front?
You can have a look at the vertical position and movement, so like the height of the head and also like how they're moving together. So your horse might be walking with their head set and neck set quite high, so the nose might be sitting up, around with a height or a dash lower. That might be considered a high headset. Your horse might have a low headset, so they might be choosing to put their head, closer toward their knees while you're walking, or always be trying to drag their head further along the ground. They may have an inconsistent headset, so that it just like it kind of moves up and down or in a strange sort of figure eight shape. And you might also find that it's very fixed. And sometimes you might even find that they never change. The headset is always like at exactly the same point. That might be like nose at shoulder level, or, at a bit higher. What
Especially
else?
when you turn them, like we're talking about looking at them from the front, but also, as you're turning around to come back, you might notice that the head and neck just stays really straight, and that there's no ability to kind of turn.
Yeah. And with those horses, you often drag them. Like you
Mhm.
really drag, and you see that people, they have to drag, and they'll have this sort of stiff motion. And sometimes they'll laterally flex a lot at like the pole, but the neck itself doesn't bend around.
Yeah,
And
they drop the shoulder out to
yeah,
compensate for the
yeah,
lack of motion through their neck.
yeah,
And the other one, with a stiff head and neck where it's not moving, is sometimes so they might drag behind, but they can also drag the owner, because it's like the head and neck is down and forward, and all their momentum is forward, and they can become quite like strong in the way they pull the owner. It's like they're so set in that position that yeah, they can just kind of set against the lead rope and just sort of keep tractoring towards where
bear
they want to
down.
go. And once you give them back some flexibility through their head and neck, you gain back control. But the reason you gain back control is because the horse gains back its balance. And so it has the ability to like adjustability in the head and neck, as opposed to just being like, I can't move my head and neck. It's splintered in that position.
Definitely. And when considering, let's say you're watching the horse move, because there are so many variation that you see in all horses, what would you consider to be relatively normal at a walk?
Yeah, so in a walk that's at a good pace, you'll see what we call like a figure of eight motion. So it'll go like up. So the figure of eight is like a cross. So it's like a figure of eight laying on the
Like an
side, I guess.
infinity symbol.
Yeah, and so you'll see the horse kind of go from side to side in a figure of eight motion through the head and neck. So in a walk, we don't want to see a head and neck that is still. So if the head and neck is really still in the walk, then there's an issue there. As they get faster, you'll see the head and neck go a little bit more up and down. But if a horse is really like, I call them like a emu neck, you know,
Pecking.
where they, an emu and ostrich, where they kind of are like up and down, up and down, up and down. That is not normal in a walk either. And often they'll have a higher head carriage and they will be a bit kind of flexed at the pole, those horses. So yeah, that's probably the biggest thing in the walk that I'm looking for, that nice, soft, even figure of eight, side to side, up and down motion, like all in one. What about anything else?
No, not really in the walk. That's a definitely something to look for. With the trot, you'll definitely see a decrease in that figure eight motion though. The head and neck isn't supposed to become stiff and braced, but it does still. It's the neck, the bones of the neck are a large attachment point for some of the muscles that pull the limbs forward.
Yeah.
And so you'll see that it becomes still, but it still has the ability to stretch out and lengthen and then contract as well. So it's not about it just becoming rigid and braced, or and you'll often see sometimes for horses in the trot, when they go into the trot, they'll reef their head up like they're using it as a piece of as a weight, basically, with momentum to throw themselves into a higher gait. So looking for that is a key indicator too, that their thoracic sling might not be working as well as it could be.
Or they can't push from
Yeah,
behind either, so they're kind of
yeah.
using that head and neck to lift themselves up into the trot instead of pushing and creating engagement from behind and lifting them up into the trot.
What about in the canter?
Yeah, in the canter, the head and neck should just really follow the motion. So it shouldn't look like it's creating the motion, if that makes sense. So I've seen some horses, especially as they're asked to go up into a more collected canter, and you see it at the highest levels too sometimes when they're asked to go up into a collected canter, or doing canter pirouettes and stuff, where the horses that are struggling to use their bodies biomechanically correct, there's a lot of kind of up and down motion in the head, as if they're using that to create the canter motion, instead of it just kind of following the motion that's coming through the power, through the hind end, and then being transmitted to the lift of the thoracic sling, which means that the head and neck should also be a part of that lift of the thoracic sling. So they should be able to hold it, just allowing the motion to flow through, as opposed to using it to help them create the motion. I think that's really important. Like Jelly, when he had a lot of trouble with his canter, he would, from a riding perspective, but even when I was watching him, it's like his head and neck was tilted downwards, but then it was propelling him, and from a riding perspective, it felt like he was like a steam train pulling me forward and down. So then once he's able to use his hind end more correctly, that he became a lot lighter in front, and he held his head and neck up in its position. So that's really important. The head is also super useful to look at lameness, especially in the trot, because like you said, it should be still in the trot. So what kind of things do we see when we're looking at head and neck from a lameness perspective?
So the most broadly known would be the saying down on sound, up on bad. So that you can just straight up see, okay, my horse's head is traveling down when the forelimb that's healthy or healthier is on the ground. So that's
So they're happy to load that up then.
Yeah. And then as the other limb that isn't as comfortable is on the ground, when it should be weight bearing, the horse instead shifts their weight up and off that limb as it travels underneath them. So
Yeah. So,
down.
yeah.
Oh, well, just, and then also when you're looking from the front, you can also make an evaluation about some hind limb lameness. So down with the hind limb that's lame as it hits the ground. So you'll be able to see, sometimes you need to look from different directions because you can't always, it's hard to coordinate looking at the back limb as you're also looking at the head. But as they bring the hind limb through, they'll throw the head up in the air.
Yeah. Or they'll throw it down as it hits the ground.
Yeah.
So, and it really depends. Like obviously we're trying to give you just a bit of a simple overview of the head and neck, but there's a lot of complexities in lameness evaluation. Um, and so where depending, and horses can have multi-limb lamenesses, which make it very difficult. Hind limb lameness is very challenging, even for experienced clinicians. So we're just kind of giving you a bit of an understanding as to why, so when that hind limb hits the ground, they want to get off it. So that's why they're going to put the weight forward. But if they need to swing it through, they might use the head and neck to lift to help them bring it through if there's a problem with bringing it through. So it's really, we're talking about unilateral, like one limb lameness, which is not always the case. But basically in the trot, if there's a variation from still, then there's something going on. And sometimes you'll just see, like I've had horses where they just get like this little head tilt. So there's just an asymmetry in that motion. And even Jelly, if I look back at videos of him bridleless, he kind of looks like a jiggly dog. Like he looks kind of like he's happy because his head's going like dunk, dunk, dunk. And it's like, I think some of that head motion is actually him pulling his
Right.
hind along. And so he's using his head always for both hind limbs to like pull along. So you see this little head like kind of wobbling from side to side. And so it can be quite subtle in that situation. And he was pricked happy behavior, but you just saw this little like dunk, dunk, dunk. So that's a consideration there when we're looking for that nice stillness in the, like you said, not brace in the trot.
Definitely.
So,
So,
yep, sorry.
oh, I was going to say, if that is something that you can see the head and neck from the front of the horse, the second area that we're going to talk about is the pelvis. So how would you, or what are the things that you'd be looking for in the pelvis as an observation that you can make?
So I think it's first of all just getting your eye in on the bony landmarks, and the bony landmarks that we look at for the pelvis are the very top part of the pelvis, which was known as the tuba sacrale or sacral tuberosities, or some people might be familiar with the term hunter's bump. So it's like the highest point of the pelvis. So there's one on each side. So getting your eye in on that, and then the tubercoxae are like the points of the pelvis that some people might know as the points of the hip, but it's not the hip, it's the pelvis. And it's the most, I guess it's the widest part of the horse's pelvis from, when you're looking from the back, and it's towards the front at the back of the ribs there. So that's your tubercoxae. And then your tuba ischii is the pointer buttock. And so you're looking at the motion of those three bony landmarks, also relative to the center, the sacrum, and the tail, and then how they're kind of moving through. And you want to look at the symmetry, like of both sides relative to each other. But then you also want to look at the quality of that motion. So there's an ability for it to go up and down and forward and back, and then there's like that motion, like the head and neck, and there's like that rotational motion in there. And so you want to balance between those three motions, specifically in the walk. So a balance between the up and down, the cranial caudal or the front to back, and the like side to side. So you've got that figure of eight movement going through there in the walk as well. So what about if we're looking at it from the trot perspective?
So going into the trot, you are going to see a motion that pushes each side sort of up and down, like against each other. So the right side will come up, left side goes down, left side comes up, right side goes down, particularly at the top of the pelvis. So you might be looking at the space in between the sacral tuberosity and the tuberosity. So you want to see that they're coming up and down symmetrically and that it's not over exaggerated. So it shouldn't be like a really big difference, and it should be somewhat even in the motion as well. And then you're also going to see a very slight like side to side motion. There's a lot less rotation like there is in the walk, but there's a very slight lateral motion as you go through as well. So you'll see often the tail, just like it'll go slightly side to side, and you want to make sure that that in itself is even too. So at the tail head, you can just see if it's traveling left to right mildly, and you'll also see it in the tail. The tail is very useful because like you can see the motion travel all the way down quite well. So if the tail is hanging all the way to one side or all the way to the other side, it's a good indicator that there's something going on in there, and the pelvic motion is blocked because it's not flowing through the tail like it should be.
Yeah, and sometimes with the tail, you'll see a tail that's, like you mentioned, the one that's held to one side. That's pretty obvious. Sometimes you'll see a tail that's just held out and still. Or the other one is you see the tail where it's still at the top, but the bottom like is moving. And so there's not a flow coming through the sacrum and the tail. Like it should just, there should be a flow coming through there. And so yeah, the tail is super useful. Or the other one is you'll just see a tail that's like still and it just lacks a lot of motion. Or you'll get the twisting tail, which I think is more like there's a pain related response there as opposed to just a biomechanical alteration, where they're twisting or swishing a lot. Obviously, flies can be a part of that and spurs can be another part of that, but that's more an indicator of discomfort.
Definitely.
And then when we look at the canter, so in the canter, it's actually the lumbosacral joint in front of the pelvis that creates most of that motion. But because of that motion through there, you'll see the points of the pelvis flex and extend. So they'll like go, yes, you describe it as a up and down, forward and back type motion. But that's mostly coming from that lumbosacral joint, as opposed to the sacroiliac joint, which only has like 5 degrees of motion. So you should just see a nice flexion through that area. And some horses, like in the canter, you'll see they're really high behind, and they kind of pop up instead of being able to sit down. So Jelly used to do that quite a lot. And then the hind legs are kind of look like pogo sticks a bit more, or they kind of look stuck underneath themselves. So that's pretty useful for getting those bony landmarks in. And then when we see the hip hike for a lame horse through the pelvis, Sophie talked about that symmetry of motion, and especially in the trot. And so what will happen with a lame horse is that you'll get a bigger motion in the side that's lame, basically. So there's often a bigger downward motion through the pelvis as they're kind of bearing the weight onto that lame limb. So yeah, if you've got a bigger motion on one side, usually that's the lame side. It's not always that simple because from a biomechanical perspective, we're also looking at stiffness as well as increased motion, but that's just the general explanation of a hip hike. What about, have you got anything else to add with the pelvis?
No, don't think so. Just that I definitely think that when you get a good vision of a horse cantering on a straight line, you don't often get that because once you're in a canter, you are often on a circle because it's such a fast stride. Like it's not often that you're just cantering in a straight line and someone's observing you from behind. Just by chance, because I've mustered horses consistently for the last few years, I think I've seen that very commonly. It's also not a view that you often get on like cross-country cameras, like directly from behind. I have found you're often seeing them on an angle, but once you really see them from behind, it's quite a jarring motion when you've got a really blocked pelvis. Like as the horse canters, and there's particularly in a straight line, there's often one leg that'll deviate more than the other. So it'll like swing out to the side, or you'll see it more stiff as it travels through, or it paddles a bit more than you think it does when you're seeing it on a circle. Like it just seems to be really apparent in a straight line, particularly when you can stay with them for so long and watch from behind. But yeah, it's just like that slight motion as the legs are split and there is a bit of rotation in the pelvis in the canter, depending on the lead. Like there's a really distinct difference there if you get lucky enough to see it.
Yeah, and just losing that kind of smoothness and flow is probably a big thing with issues showing up in the pelvis.
Yeah, definitely. How about our third category, limb alignment? This is, and just to point out, this is the one that I think is so valuable for having something to walk against, like a fence or a wall if you can, because even a small thing like you pulling on the head too hard or you walking into their shoulder will change how you observe this category. And that one of the biggest things that you can look for in limb alignment is the stance versus the swing phase. So the stance versus the swing phase is, the swing phase is when the horse is traveling, the limb that you're looking at is traveling through the air, and the stance phase is when the limb is grounded. So the point between when the foot hits the ground and when it starts to come up off the ground. And there's lots of things that you can look at in the stance and swing phase. How straight the limb travels towards you. So, does it deviate? Does it paddle out to the side? Does it come forward a little bit and then right before it hits the ground, does it sort of like swing in or swing out? A lot of horses will do that. Like right before it hits the ground, it'll like travel medially quite quickly or something like that. You can also see whether this is really in the hoof category, but whether you are hitting the ground laterally or medially with the hoof as well. In the stance and the swing phase, you can see whether or not they travel really quickly through the air in the swing phase, but take a long time on the stance phase. What else would you say you're always looking for? Besides alignment, that's the other thing. When you're looking from the front, you are able to compare it with the front legs and the back legs and see whether or not they're traveling through on the same line. So, does the back leg really obviously swing out in a different trajectory than the front limb, or does it travel through quite evenly in the same position, like as if they're straight, like they're toothpicks standing one behind another?
Yeah, I think that's super valuable. Like comparing the front legs to the back legs, and as you said, in the stance and the swing phase, because what you'd like to see if you're on a straight line is you're just seeing two sets of legs, really. You might see the hind legs as they come around the body a little bit in the swing phase, but ideally they're staying in alignment, especially that lower limb area, staying in alignment with each other. And the other thing you can look at in that alignment is, so you mentioned like the swing phase, but do the joints lift to the same position, so you can look at the fetlock joints and the carpus, the knee joint, and see, do they lift to the same place, as well as, their alignment to the hind end. And then when you're looking at, also, well, it's both phases, I guess, but the coordination of the limbs, so are they coming close and knocking each other in any certain position? I also, so actually it was interesting the other day because I was walking jelly over the poles, and I had the video from behind. And so it's hard when you're walking a horse over the poles because I walk with the horse, or sometimes I'll walk backwards, and that can be really useful. So I'll often walk backwards and have a look at my horse's limb alignment, their pelvis. You just got to make sure you're out of the way and you're not kind of, constricting their motion. But I videoed it, and it was really interesting watching his right hind go through its swing phase because it deviated medially and it landed medially. And from my perspective, not videoing it, I could say that compared to how he usually is, he was straighter through his body. And so he was able to maintain the straightness through the body, but then having the video, it was able to show me how the limb was still deviating. So that was super beneficial for me to have that video. So that's good. And then on the circles, I will put them on a gentle circle, but try to keep the body aligned to itself. So keep all the vertebrae in a line. Tori describes it as keeping the train carriages on the train tracks. And then have a look at how the limbs stay in line with that, because majority of horses, a lot of horses, there'll be a deviation in that. Like they'll cross the leg over the midline or towards the midline, or they'll step wide with a leg, or they'll drop their shoulder out and that changes your limb alignment, or they'll tweak their head and neck, which comes back to the head and neck, which then shifts the limb alignment. So I find putting them on a curve and walking backwards, if you're coordinated, be careful, but that's really useful because you can really visualize it yourself. And that's hard to get a visual on a camera because unless you've got a GoPro, and you're able to look at them from the front going on the circle, it can be harder to assess that limb alignment when you're videoing like from the outside or inside of a circle, unless you can get them as they come round one part of the circle. So yeah, that's super valuable for limb alignment. What else would you like to add there?
I suppose going into backup, it's something that people use as a tool to practice, or to try and find lumbosacral flexion and lots of different things, but there's so much that you can see in a backup, and that includes whether or not your horse is traveling backwards straight. Actually, before we go into this, just wanted to say it's how you get your horse to back up is really important, because I've been in situations where you ask somebody to back up so that you can make an assessment, and they travel very quickly. The horse is used to being rushed backwards, or it's being used as a deterrent. So they're trying to shape behavior. So when you ask them to back up, I try and just do it with as minimal pressure as you can. One, because it'll tell you how willing they are, how much pressure is needed to ask them to go backwards. And also when they travel really slowly, you have to use control. And so you get a better view sometimes of just how much control or evenness they have traveling backwards. So when you're going backwards, you can see whether or not they travel straight. So does the hind leg, deviate outwards, or do they sort of like after a couple of steps, the whole body starts to spin off and go off to the side? Also, if you can video from the side as well, or have somebody do that, you can see whether or not the steps are even going backwards, or if they sort of get stuck with one leg on the ground. So sometimes when they go backwards, you'll find that one hind leg kind of like there's a moment where it can't quite easily get off the ground before it travels backwards, and they'll have a moment of like, crack, and then take it backwards. You can see whether or not they're traveling paired going backwards, or if they're not paired. I know you have some thoughts on this. Do you want to elaborate on when it isn't ideal to have paired and conditioning that as opposed to walking back one step at a time?
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally they would, they're able to have it paired. Like if everything is working properly, you should be able to slow them down and they should maintain the pair, but a lot of horses, when you slow them down, all of a sudden can't. Yeah, I think for this webinar, like it's more just looking at the straightness of them, how much they drag, how much they can stay, the forelimbs and the hind limbs can stay in alignment, and also, yeah, just how even they can be. Like you said with the back legs that you've had horses, that get sticky behind, which is definitely like Jelly's issue. But I also have a client's horse at the moment who's sticky in front. And so she like leaves her front leg there, and then at the last, so it's almost like she leans back before she steps back. And so, there's a reason that she's not wanting to pick that front leg up. So yeah, looking at how each leg is picked up and how it swings in the back up, and then how it's moved through the back up, and then how aligned it is with the other limbs, let alone we're not really talking about all the body things that happen with back up. We're just focusing on mostly the limb alignment in this particular podcast. So yeah, I think that's about it.
Definitely. I think those three things are definitely things people could go home and do immediately. Just have a quick look. It doesn't have to be perfect, but like you were saying, having a record to look back on, even if it's not because you think you need to change anything, simply having this to look back on, like the amount of times that people get an injury and then other things happen in the body, there's compensation. You're like, was this normal? And they're like, I couldn't tell you. The ability to go back and have a look at videos, or I go back and I wish that I'd taken more of my own horses, to be like, oh yeah, I learned this, and is there any chance that's relevant to my horse, would be super valuable.
Yeah, and it's really useful too, just to look at them as they walk up to you in the paddock and walk away from you in the paddock. Sometimes there's a different motion when they're free as opposed to when we're doing things with them. And just, the number of times too, like you just said then, where people just haven't looked. So just observing your horse's head and neck position in the different gaits, your horse's pelvic motion in the different gaits, and their limb alignment in the different gaits. Like just starting to get your eye in on those in whatever circumstance you're in. Like if you can video it, great, but if you're just going out to catch your horse, observe it, just go and catch your horse. Go to a competition or a rally or something and just observe those three things on horses, Just the more you can develop your eye, then the more you can empower your relationship with your own horse. So it's extremely valuable, and then you can start to build on those foundations. And there's always another layer and another layer that you can look at. But yeah, go start looking at these three areas. Cool. Well, thank you for joining myself, Dr. Raquel Butler and Sophie Vandenberg in today's podcast. Enjoy your horse time. Please subscribe to the Equine Functional Podcast so you don't miss our weekly episodes, and give us a 5-star rating so that we can share more valuable insights.
And we'll see you in the next exciting episode.